who is Brian Stettin. He is with the Treatment Advocacy Center's policy center. Hello, can I just start that all over again, please? He is the Treatment Advocacy Center's policy director. And in 1999, as he was an assistant New York State Attorney General, he was instrumental in conceiving and drafting Kendra's Law, landmark legislation that established assisted outpatient treatment in New York. After leaving the Attorney General's office in 2007, Brian served as special counsel to the New York State Commissioner of Criminal Justice Services and counsel to the Health Committee of the New York Assembly. Since joining the Treatment Advocacy Center in 2009, Brian has worked with state legislators and policymakers across the United States, trying to improve mental health commitment laws and establish AOT, assisted outpatient treatment programs. Brian is a 1991 graduate of the City College of New York and a 1995 graduate of the University of Texas School of Law. And I'd also like to say that Brian has been working with one of our board members, especially Dennis Shannon, on trying to get some new language drafted and presented to our legislators here in Alabama to get our to improve our commitment laws. So we're so grateful to you being here today. Brian, I'll let you take over and do your thing.
Thank you so much, Connie, and great to be with you all. Huge bummer it's not in person as we all had hoped, but you know, things happen, and hope you all are taking the actions you need to help us get to the other side of this horrible pandemic. And of course, my thoughts are with your great leader, Kelly. So my presentation today is about the very thing that Connie was just alluding to, the fact that there is this real great need to reform Alabama's civil commitment laws in the assessment of my organization, the Treatment Advocacy Center. And this is kind of a reprise of a presentation I did for your NAMI Alabama Leadership Conference 6 months ago. So those of you who heard that, apologies for the rerun, but I think it's really important for the general membership to also understand what we as two organizations that are going to work in harmony have in mind to make things much better on the ground there. Because, you know, as Connie mentioned, we are hoping to get legislation introduced next year that we're going to need all of you to be kind of the grassroots muscle behind. So I'm going to walk through what I see as the kind of the major problems in the law as it exists, and what I think are some pretty easy and straightforward fixes. Let me just kind of start by talking generally about this idea of civil commitment, because that's the area of the mental health law that my organization is focused on, and then I'm going to really focus on the need to improve today. Civil commitment is a real priority for the Treatment Advocacy Center. We as a nonprofit are really focused squarely on the needs of people with severe mental illness who don't recognize their own need for care because they, you know, aspects of their clinical condition or the fact that they're currently in a psychiatric crisis makes it apparent to them that they have this desperate need for treatment. And when people are in that situation, you know, they are not going to be able to do it voluntarily, not going to be able to do it on their own. We want to minimize the need for involuntary commitment, but we also have to recognize that a really fully functional, compassionate mental health system is going to make that possible at the moments where it's needed. And we really see people who are in that predicament as being, you know, our constituency, our people, and their families as well, of course. You know, just to be very clear about it, we think of civil commitment as a last resort. If you can engage somebody in treatment voluntarily, that's always better in every way. But sometimes I get frustrated when I hear, you know, advocates kind of say that we're hoping to get to the day where we don't need civil commitment because we're going to make our voluntary system of care so wonderful that people are going to, you know, come flocking to it. We're going to eradicate stigma so that people see no reason not to seek treatment when they have a mental health crisis. And look, I'm all for doing all that stuff, but I think we also have to recognize that as long as severe mental illness is with us, there is always going to be this need for really strong civil commitment laws. This is an inescapable need for a functional mental health system. And the reason for that is a phenomenon known as anosognosia, right? This is a neurological symptom that is very often a corollary of severe mental illness, and it's not going away no matter how wonderful we make our mental health system. Anosognosia basically means the inability of someone to recognize their own need for treatment because they are certain that they don't have the illness that they've been diagnosed with. When someone is experiencing anosognosia, they are certain to their core that they are fine. And sometimes this is mistaken for denial, right? Someone will say, you know, my son is in denial. He doesn't want to take his meds. I think it's really important for all of us as advocates to recognize the difference between denial and anosognosia. Denial is a universal human defense mechanism. It is something that all of us, whether we have mental illness or not, have practiced at one time or another in our lives when there is some painful truth that we really do know deep down, but we don't want to admit it to ourselves. We need some help kind of coaxing that to the surface. Maybe a good friend or talking to a professional can help us address that truth, confront it, move on with life. That's not what's going on with someone who has anosognosia. This is about dysfunction of an organ of the body, i.e. the brain. It is about information not reaching the brain that would prevent a person from knowing the truth deep down, right? And this is completely out of the person's control. And from their point of view, we have to understand that not adhering to treatment is perfectly logical and sensible. It's exactly what any of us would do. You know, if somebody told you, if you don't have diabetes and you know you don't have it, and somebody's telling you got to take an insulin shot every day, you're going to tell them to get lost. And that's what it's like for somebody who's told that they need this treatment for mental illness to the point where they just cannot see it. It is perfectly logical and sensible. We have to keep that in mind when we have this natural tendency to be frustrated with the individual. And here, just to bring this point home, we're looking at brain scans of two individuals with schizophrenia. One person who has insight into their illness and the other who does not. And it's important to keep in mind that not everybody with severe mental illness is going to experience anosognosia. And for some people, it's fixed as part of their baseline. And for other people, it's something that waxes and wanes. But at this particular moment, when one person has insight and the other person does not, these individuals are being asked to perform a self-reflective activity. And you can actually see brain activity, right? Synapses firing in that brain on the right-hand side that just aren't happening for the other person. So, you know, it should be clear this is no more in a person's control than would be dysfunction of any organ of the body that any of us might experience. And so this is what creates this urgent need, and will always create an urgent need for us to take some action to help a person out of this situation. And the recommendations I'm going to make and the analysis I'm going to present for how the Alabama law deals with folks in this predicament comes from this report that my organization, Treatment Advocacy Center, put out last year called Grading the States, where we analyzed the civil commitment laws of every state, how well the laws themselves address the need for involuntary treatment at certain junctures in the person's recovery. And one thing I want to make clear about this report is it is not an analysis of the mental health systems themselves. So the states that get really good grades, we're not saying that they necessarily have great mental health systems any better than Alabama's. It just means that the laws themselves facilitate having a good mental health system. There's a lot of other things that can go wrong. Most typically a lack of funding, a lack of community-based resources, a lack of hospital beds, et cetera, that can make a mental health system dysfunctional. So having good laws is a necessary but not sufficient element to having a great state mental health system. And I don't mean to suggest that if we fix the laws in Alabama, it's going to be a magic bullet and everything's going to be wonderful for you and your loved ones. But it's a starting point. It's something we've got to do first. It's something we've got to address before we can move on to some of the other challenges that you're undoubtedly facing. And in this report, we give each state a report card. Here's Alabama's. I know this is too small to read, but just to give you an idea of the fact that we are addressing lots of different aspects of Alabama's laws, as we do with all states in this report, and coming up with this formula for grading the quality of the laws in the aggregate. And, it brings me no joy to say that we found Alabama's to be pretty lacking. We gave you all a D minus based on issues that we think can be remedied. And that's what the bill we're going to talk about today would do. But here's a map of the US where you can see all the states regionally. And there are some that do even worse. We have some Fs in there. But a D minus is obviously a grade that we want to do everything we can to improve. So let's kind of take some time then to go through what the factors are that led to that grade and what the basis for improvement might be. As just kind of a scene setting overview here, it's important to understand that Alabama, like all states, has three key standards for civil commitment, three points at which it is necessary to have important language in the law that will allow us to facilitate the process of civil commitment. The first is what we call the emergency evaluation standard, or the pickup standard. That is what must be observed in the community to justify taking a person against their will out of the community to an evaluation facility to be evaluated to see if they are in need of involuntary commitment. Second is what we call the inpatient commitment standard. That is the actual standard that the clinician is going to apply in evaluating the person once they have been brought to that emergency facility under that detention, and then ultimately for the court to assess whether the evidence has been presented to establish that the person is actually in need of being civilly committed as an inpatient. And third, the outpatient commitment standard. That is what a clinician and a court must find to allow a person to be committed to community-based care after they have been stabilized through inpatient commitment, and the person's ready to go back into the community. Alabama, like almost all states, all but 3 states, also allow a person to receive what we sometimes call AOT, assisted outpatient treatment. That is civil commitment to stay adherent to a treatment plan while living in the community as a way of avoiding having to return to the hospital by staying out of that state of crisis. So those are the 3 major standards we're going to look at and see how Alabama measures up in making sure that the language facilitates a person receiving treatment at these 3 junctures. So let's just look at the language as it exists now. The emergency evaluation standard in Alabama, the pickup standard, requires a meeting of the minds between a law enforcement officer and a community mental health officer. They must jointly believe, in order to have this person removed from the community, taken to an evaluation facility, they must jointly believe that this person is mentally ill and posing an immediate danger to themselves or others. Okay, and keep that in mind as we move now to the inpatient commitment standard, what it takes to have somebody held in a hospital for a period of time for treatment. Here you've got to find 4 things. This is what the clinician is going to have to find when the person is brought to them, and what they're ultimately going to have to prove to the court. First, that the person is mentally ill. Second, that as a result of the mental illness, the person poses a real and present threat of substantial harm to themselves and or others. Third, that the person will, if not treated, continue to suffer mental distress and continue to experience deterioration of the ability to function independently. And fourth, that the person is unable to make a rational and informed decision as to whether or not treatment for mental illness would be desirable. Okay, and I've highlighted that second one because that I think is the one that's going to tend to be the most in controversy at points where someone is challenging their commitment as an inpatient, whether they pose a real and present threat of substantial harm to self or others. The third key law we're looking at here is that outpatient commitment standard, what it takes to get somebody into an AOT program. And here you've got 3 criteria instead of the 4 we saw previously, and you'll see that I won't read them all again, but they are 3 of the same 4 that you saw before. You've got to find almost everything you have to find to put somebody under an inpatient commitment. The one thing that drops out is when you're committing somebody to outpatient commitment, you don't have to find that they pose a real and present threat of substantial harm, because people who do pose such a real and present threat are presumed to be in need of hospital care. Here you've got somebody who's not in an acute crisis, but still has these issues, which make it likely that they're going to wind up in acute crisis if they don't stay engaged with treatment. So we have overlapping criteria for inpatient and outpatient commitment in Alabama. So let's look at what we at TAC see as the big problems with these three laws. First, the issue that we take with the emergency evaluation standard in Alabama. Remember, this is where the police officer and the community mental health officer have to come together and find that the person poses an immediate danger in order to take them to the hospital. And the problem here is that immediate danger standard is different than what it takes to actually get somebody civil committed, right? To get someone civilly committed, you have to find they pose a real and present threat of substantial harm. But in order to get that finding, you've got to get them to the hospital. And you can only get them to the hospital if they're found to pose an immediate danger. These two things are not the same, right? You can pose a real and present threat, but not necessarily an immediate threat. But if your threat is not immediate, you can't get to the hospital for that evaluation. So this creates a situation where essentially it's turning your civil commitment, your inpatient commitment standard, into a requirement of an immediate threat. Because if you don't have that immediate threat, you can't ever get the person to the point where they can be evaluated by a clinician in a hospital. That is, if you have someone who, I think we can presume is pretty typical in this situation, they're not going to go voluntarily. They're not going to submit to the exam because they don't want any part of this treatment that that they need. So, this is a problem. And it's not a problem that exists in most states. If you look at the laws around the country, you generally find that the law enforcement officer has to find basically the same thing a clinician would have to find. Now, it's not a full finding because a law enforcement officer isn't really qualified to say that a person poses a real and present threat of substantial harm, but they have to have reason to believe that they do. And if the police officer has probable cause or reason to think that a person is dangerous to themselves or others, in most states, that's enough to get them to where a clinician can make that determination definitively. But here, because we have this disagreement in what the language says, you're asking cops to find something much greater than what a clinician would ultimately have to find to civilly commit the person. That's a problem. Now let's look at what we see as the big issue with your inpatient commitment standard, which is that this term, real and present threat of substantial harm to self or others, is not defined. So what does it mean? The Alabama law, unlike the law of just about every other state, doesn't tell us, right? It's very typical nationally that state standard will require a finding that the person is a danger to themselves or others. The actual words used certainly vary a lot, but that term tends to be defined in the law. Some states define it better than others, but Alabama doesn't define it at all. It kind of leaves it to the eye of the beholder of what it means to be a real and present threat to self or others. And Alabama is one of only 5 states that offer no statutory definition of dangerousness. And that language has to be interpreted by lots of people throughout the process, right? It has to be interpreted by a police officer, observing someone in the community, a community mental health officer doing the same, a clinician making an evaluation at a hospital. It's got to be interpreted by a judge when you get to the point where you're having a civil commitment hearing. And what we find, and what I imagine many of you have found in your own lived experience, is that the assumption of what that means tends to be very narrow, right? Without any statutory guidance telling all these professionals what that language means and making clear that it's not so narrow. The tendency is of many is to think of danger strictly in terms of violent acts, attempts at suicide, right? Behavior that's outrageously dangerous and that it's likely to cause severe bodily injury, right? So even if someone's not violent or suicidal, yeah, you can usually get them civilly committed if they are doing things like walking into traffic or, thinking they could fly and jumping off buildings. That kind of stuff is not really controversial in terms of being evidence of a person posing a real and present threat to self or others. But, it is such a narrow conception of that. And there's so much pressure on the system to think in these narrow terms because of the fact that we have these terrible shortages of inpatient beds. So there's this triaging that goes on, right? It's not surprising that clinical professionals and judges are under so much pressure to make sure that they have the bed space to meet the needs for example, all these forensic folks who are being court ordered into treatment after they've been arrested, that we just have this extremely narrow idea of what it means to be a danger to yourself or others. So what's missing from that equation when we're only focused on people who are violent or suicidal or doing outrageously dangerous things? What's missing is the recognition that there are lots of other ways to be a danger to yourself or others, particularly a danger to yourself, and to pose a real and present threat to yourself. One big example of that is the idea of being gravely disabled, right? And this, what we mean by this is the inability to meet your basic survival needs. If your untreated mental illness is preventing you from obtaining the basic things you need to survive, right? Food, clothing, shelter, medical care. That's a form of danger to self. That's not going to show up in an analysis that's only focused on whether you are walking into traffic or threatening to kill yourself or somebody else. But it's undoubtedly, when we think about it, a very real form of being dangerous to yourself, because you're not going to last very long without an ability to provide yourselves with the basic survival needs of life. And this is something that in all the 45 states that do have a statutory definition of danger, you will find language recognizing that this is a form of danger to self. The other level of this, before I move to that, let me just show you an example of what grave disability language looks like. Here we have the law of Alaska, which says that a person can be hospitalized involuntarily if they are gravely disabled. And they define that as a condition in which a person, as a result of their mental illness, is in danger of physical harm arising from such complete neglect of their basic needs for food, clothing, shelter, or personal safety as to render serious accident, illness, or death highly probable if care by another is not taken. This sounds like common sense, right? But it's something that just gets lost in the shuffle because we don't have language like this in the Alabama law. So moving then to the next level of what it means to be a danger to yourself or others. And here we have what we call the idea of a psychiatric deterioration standard. And what we're recognizing here is that there is a universal danger faced by individuals in psychosis of harm to their brain, psychiatric deterioration, right? The likelihood that we know is very real from the research that delaying treatment, that allowing a person to remain in a state of untreated psychosis will cause brain damage, actual harm to the brain. We have multiple studies linking the duration of untreated psychosis to a lower prospects for that person to achieve recovery. And the bottom line here is that we don't have the luxury of just kind of waiting around for the person to have a realization, an epiphany that they need treatment, or to suffer so much that they become so desperate that they ask for it. That kind of tough love might make sense in other contexts in life, but it's a luxury we don't have in this situation, because the data tells us that every day that person remains in this state of untreated psychosis, there is harm sustained to the brain that's getting worse and worse, and making it that much less likely that that person is going to be able to achieve recovery and get the life back that they would want for themselves and deserve. So this, again, is a form of being dangerous to yourself if you can't protect yourself from that kind of brain damage. And we haven't gotten to the point where this is universally recognized, but we're halfway there. We've got almost half the states that have language in their definition of danger to self or others that recognize psychiatric deterioration as a form of danger to self. And of course, we don't have that at all in Alabama because we don't have a definition at all. So if we are able to put one into the law, this is something we certainly want to have made a part of it. And to give you an example of what this language looks like in the laws of Michigan, Michigan defines a person requiring treatment to mean one of three things. The first is that they are likely to cause physical harm. The second is that they are gravely disabled. And then the third possibility is this psychiatric deterioration standard, which I have here on this slide. And they define it as such. They say an individual who has mental illness whose judgment is so impaired by that mental illness and whose lack of understanding of the need for treatment has caused him or her to demonstrate an unwillingness to voluntarily participate in or adhere to treatment that is necessary on the basis of competent clinical opinion to prevent a relapse or harmful deterioration of his or her condition, and which presents a substantial risk of significant physical or mental harm to the individual or others. And I really love that they have mental harm in there, right? Because it's recognizing that harm to the brain. I mean, you could even argue harm to the brain is a form of physical harm, because the brain, last time I checked, is an organ of the body. So, in some sense, it's sad that we have to say physical or mental as if the two things are different. But because they are not universally recognized as one and the same, I think it's really good to have that language in the law to make clear that harm to the brain counts. It's something we have every reason and right to protect an individual from. So let's then look at what we see as the problem with Alabama's outpatient commitment standard, which, just to review, is a lot like your inpatient commitment standard, except that it removes this need for finding that the person is that poses a threat of real and present harm. But all the other stuff is still there. And these criteria, being drawn from the inpatient commitment standard, are really describing a person who is currently in a psychiatric crisis. But here's the problem. Outpatient commitment, AOT, is a crisis prevention tool. It's not a crisis response tool. So when we are putting someone in AOT, we want the law to allow us to use it in a situation where the person is not currently in a psychiatric crisis. The best time to put somebody in AOT is when they're about to come out of the hospital, right? Use it as a discharge planning tool from a person being hospitalized. On the day they come out, hopefully they have been stabilized through that treatment they've received to where the crisis is no longer present. And that's the reason that they get to go home that day, right? But we want to make sure that if a person seems likely to wind up in crisis again very soon, that we have this opportunity to engage them in outpatient care. And so when you are requiring a person to currently be in crisis to get them into AOT, the result is that you are disqualifying the typical person who's best situated to benefit from AOT, the person whose crisis has been abated, who is coming out of a hospital and is really in need of this to avoid winding up in that predicament again. So I just think that the current criteria are kind of misguided and reflect maybe a misunderstanding on the part of the legislature as to when we want to put AOT, outpatient commitment, in place. So just to kind of tie this to the exact language you have in the law, right? To place somebody under an outpatient commitment in Alabama right now, you have to find that as a result of their mental illness, if they're not treated, they will continue to suffer mental distress and continue to experience deterioration of their ability to function independently. When you say that they have to be continuing to do those things, that suggests that the person is currently suffering and deteriorating, right? It just sends the wrong signal, because we want to be able to apply this to a person who is not at the moment suffering mental distress and not at the moment experiencing deterioration of their ability to function independently. And then the law goes on to say that you have to find that the person is unable to make a rational and informed decision as to whether treatment for mental illness would be desirable. And this arguably relates only to the individual state of mind at the time of the hearing, right? So if they come to court and they are at that moment able to make a rational, informed decision, you wouldn't be able to find them qualified for AOT. But there's plenty of folks who need AOT that at the moment they're being discharged from the hospital, their ability to make rational, informed decisions has been restored. And they may even recognize that treatment is in their best interest. Now, you might wonder, well, what's the point of putting somebody under a court order to be engaged with treatment when they are at that moment recognizing that they have that need and they're not resisting treatment? The answer, I think, will be clear to anybody who's experienced this personally or seen a loved one go through it. It's very common with people with severe mental illness to have every intention at the moment they're coming out of a hospital to stay engaged with treatment, but to have a great difficulty hanging on to that intention. So there's a very familiar pattern that a couple of weeks after release, people will start to feel euphoric and thoughts will start to creep in. Hey, maybe I don't really need these meds after all. And with outpatient commitment, when a person has demonstrated that pattern of behavior, we have an opportunity to get ahead of that thought cycle, to have the person recognize that they are under court order and there's a court with expectations of them to stay engaged with treatment. And so, you know, that personal choice to disengage is not really going to be there. So we want to, as I say, get in front of that thought process before it occurs for certain folks. That's why it's so important to not have to make this finding at a point where you're putting someone AOT when they may actually be doing pretty well. So with those kind of major flaws in the law explained, let's take a look at the bill that we at TAC have drafted in consultation with our friends in the leadership of NAMI, Alabama. We address each of these three issues head on in this bill. I'm really excited about the language we've come up with and for our prospects of getting something done next year. The first thing we do is, for the first time ever, provide a definition for this term that exists in the law that we've talked about, a real and present threat of substantial harm to self or others, would now be defined in the section of the law that provides definitions for all kinds of other terms. The definition would be that the person poses a significant risk of behaviors that will result as a result of the mental illness in action or inaction, by action or inaction, cause, allow, or inflict serious bodily harm upon himself, herself, or another individual. That's the part that I think people already understand is part of what it means to pose a real and present threat. But then we have this additional piece of language which combines both your gravely disabled standard that we talk about, as well as a psychiatric deterioration standard. It would say that the person is unable to satisfy his or her need for nourishment, medical care, shelter, or self-protection, such that there's a substantial likelihood that death, serious bodily harm, serious physical debilitation, serious mental debilitation, or life-threatening disease would ensue. So, you know, that gets to your inability to meet basic survival needs, your gravely disabled standard, but also because we're talking about the need for medical care and the need to avoid serious mental debilitation, it also gets to your need for a psychiatric deterioration standard. And with this as the law of Alabama, it doesn't necessarily mean, as I say, overnight that it's going to be easier to get people hospitalized, but there's going to be a legal basis for it. And if someone tries to tell you that your loved one doesn't meet criteria because they're not violent or suicidal, you will be able to open up the law book and say, hey, that's not what the law says you have to find. There is this other opportunity to have this person hospitalized. So we think with some public education, some education of the professionals interpreting the law, that we could have this lead to a real change in how it's understood to be dangerous to yourself or others. The second thing we're going to do to address the need for alignment between your pickup criteria and your inpatient criteria is we're going to get rid of this idea that the person has to be found to be in immediate danger to get picked up from the community and brought to an evaluation facility. So we're going to replace at the 2 points where you have to find an immediate danger, that is the police officer having to find an immediate danger and then getting in touch with the community mental health officer and them having to find an immediate danger. We're going to place that with both of those professionals having to find simply a real and present threat of substantial harm, which, as we've talked about, is the standard for civil commitment. That will then mean that anybody who seems to meet the standard for civil commitment will be able to get to a hospital so that they can be evaluated to see if they do in fact meet the standard for civil commitment. Third thing we're going to do under this bill is revise the criteria for outpatient commitment to take away this current need to find that the person is currently in a psychiatric crisis. So we're going to take out those two places where you have to find that the person is going to continue to suffer mental distress and continue to experience deterioration. Instead, we're simply going to require the evidence that the person will, if not treated, suffer mental distress and experience deterioration, whether they are having those experiences right now or not. And secondly, we're going to add language into the law that tries to really get to the definition of who is in need of AOT, rather than limiting it to people who are currently in psychiatric crisis. We want to kind of define in the law folks who are stuck in the revolving door, people who are coming back to the hospital again and again, because of aspects of their clinical condition that make it hard for them to stay engaged with treatment. By that, I'm generally thinking of anosognosia. But the law under this bill would say that you have to prove that the person is unable to maintain consistent engagement with outpatient treatment on a voluntary basis, as demonstrated either by their actions over the last 2 years or specific aspects of their clinical condition that impair their ability to participate in treatment on a consistent basis. So, once you have this as your standard, it's not going to make AOT, it's not going to give anyone reason to worry that it's going to be possible to get anybody with severe mental illness into AOT. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to limit this to folks who have demonstrated that they have a need for it because of their inability to stay out of the hospital when left to their own devices. So that's, in a nutshell, what we have in mind. And really excited for the opportunity to partner with you all on making this happen in Alabama. Just to tell you a little more about TAC, we're not a grassroots group the way you all are. We're basically, kind of a think tank based in Washington that generates these policy ideas and puts out information to help people do advocacy in their communities. But that alone is not going to get the attention of lawmakers. You really need that ability to say, hey, I'm your constituent and I need this. My loved one needs this. And we're going to demand this of you. To be able to do that in real numbers is not something TAC can do. And so all the, good policy ideas that we can put out till the end of time are not going to change things on the ground alone. It has to be done in partnership with folks who are willing to go out there and advocate and actually hold their elected representatives' feet to the fire. And that is why just about everything that I can think of that TAC has been able to accomplish on a policy level throughout this country has been done in partnership with NAMI, state and local NAMI affiliates. You guys make it happen. You guys are in the position to take the information we provide and the expertise we've developed and bring it to the attention of the people who can actually change the laws. So very excited about the fact that we've gotten such interest from NAMI Alabama in putting this legislation forward next year. We've been in discussions with you all about who we're going to find to sponsor the bill. We're trying to pick the right member, somebody hopefully with a little bit of juice who can move this forward in your legislature in the 2022 session. But, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be really counting on all of you to put the pressure on and show up at those bill hearings and explain why these specific flaws in the law have hurt you and your loved ones, and why there is this great need to do things differently, to make treatment available to folks who need it and can't recognize their own need. So with that kind of partnership, I really do think we're unstoppable, and we've been able to accomplish a lot in other states, and see no reason why we can't make that happen with you all. So with that, I've got about 10 minutes left and would love to entertain any questions any of you have made about anything I've presented.
Gosh, thanks for that, Brian. Great presentation. And everybody is asking, can we please get a copy of this presentation? Can we
Yes.
please get a copy of this presentation? So yes, to everyone, Brian has graciously agreed to share his presentation, which is going to be a great and powerful tool for all of us to use at our NAMI meetings to get the information out so we can advocate to get this law changed. And gosh, thank you so much.
Sure
and
thing.
everyone that's been with NAMI Alabama that's been working on is like, kudos to Dennis Shannon, who kind of spearheaded this whole thing and got us connected. And it was because of your presentation that you gave us last year at our leadership that, sparked that initiative to go. And we are very grateful to you. We had a lot of comments in the chat, especially about the psychiatric deterioration key component.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Agree. And by the way, I'll also add that if any of you would like me to give this presentation or come join your local affiliate meetings, get in touch with me. My contact information is up here on this last slide, and I'm more than happy to do that.
Well, that is wonderful news. Thank you for that.
Sure
That's
thing.
great. Looking in the, let me look in the chat here real quick. We have so many, there's family members that, have struggled so much with their loved ones to get help for their family member.
Of course.
And just fighting this system because of these laws, it's just a stumbling block after stumbling block for people to get the help. So we're looking at what, as far as a time frame, we're going to think for the next legislative session, we should be able to hopefully find a sponsor for the bill.
Yeah, that's the first challenge. And if anyone has ideas on that, I'd love to hear from you.
Right.
Get in touch with Dennis Shannon as well, and Kelly, because we're all in the process of putting our heads together and trying to figure out who we want to carry this bill. Obviously, we want a legislator who has some passion for this issue. Very often the members that take the mantle on this tend to be ones who have experienced this with a family member themselves. So if we have somebody like that in mind, that's certainly something to consider. And we also want to think in terms of who are on the key committees that are going to need to advance this bill before it reaches the floor, and who seems to have influence with the leadership of the conference in each house, to where they can have some influence in getting the bill moved. Because most bills, they just kind of die of benign neglect more than actual opposition on any kind of principle. So we want to make sure that we have the attention of the right folks, and have this become a priority to move it forward.
Right. We have someone who says, you've emphasized legislature support. How important do you think it is to put articles in papers about the law?
I think when we get to the point where we have a bill introduced, we're talking about like news articles or op-eds in local papers.
Right.
That's a huge tool. Absolutely. And we have a communications department that can work with you all in trying to place that and think strategically about the right papers. The hometown papers of the key members who are going to be needed to make this happen, and also the paper in your state capital is going to be a really good place to place an op-ed, and to try and get some journalists interested in an article to tell the stories of how the existing law is really hurting families. If we can have some kind of human interest piece that's going to be relatable about how folks have been unable to get help for loved ones, and people have suffered unnecessarily because of the way the laws exist. That's something that will absolutely get the interests of folks in journalism, and can be extremely powerful. Even if we don't get everybody to read it on the day it's published, get a story like that, we'll just email the heck out of it and make sure it winds up in the inbox of every member. Right.
I mean, our personal stories are probably our most powerful tool, because then people can actually relate to what we're going through. So we had an idea from one of our members who suggests possibly Representative Matt Simpson from Baldwin County, because Baldwin County just recently established a mental health court, and it was a unanimous vote in the House for that. So there's one idea. Hope we can get that, find somebody that is going to take up the mantle and really be supportive in the legislature.
Appreciate that. Note made.
And someone else says that Mayor Maddox, I'm not sure where Mayor Maddox is from, but he made mental health a central part of his campaign. So we do have someone else
Tuscaloosa.
From Tuscaloosa. Thank you for that, John. And Ledbetter is another suggestion.
Okay, is that for the legislature, Ledbetter?
Yes. Yes. Somebody help me out. It's in Ledbetter. Who knows where he's from?
Well, I'll look him or her up and figure out how we can engage that. And I appreciate the suggestion about the mayor as well. I think it's a great idea to get mayors involved. Obviously, they do not directly get to vote on legislation, but having them as champions, having them talk this up, and even if they're willing to come to the legislative hearing and say, hey, this is something we need in our town, is going to be hugely influential. So it's a great thought.
Okay, so we've got some folks piping up, giving us some suggestions, Brian.
Awesome.
Senator Chastain, Ledbetter's from DeKalb County,
Okay.
Nathaniel Ledbetter, House District 24. So thanks everybody for helping. So I'll get all these written down and out of the chat for sure, and get
Perfect.
those suggestions to you. And then anybody else, if you think of something, you can either put it in the chat later, let me know, email me, and we'll get all that information to Brian. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
We
Be with you all.
really appreciate everything that the treatment advocate, not just for Alabama, we are grateful to you for helping us out, but really you've done so much throughout the whole United States to help get these laws changed and helping people get the services and the help that they need. We don't want to see them in the jails. We want to see them well. And
Exactly.
the earlier we can get them into some treatment, sometimes they just people don't recognize that they need the help, like you were talking about the anosognosia. So if you can't understand that you're sick, you're surely not going to ask for it, but somebody needs to be there to make sure that they do get the help they need. And that's we all want that to happen. So
Agreed. And thank you so much for that, Connie. And my pledge to you all is that if we are indeed successful, and I believe we will be in getting these changes made, we're not going to leave it there. It's just step one. The second thing is to actually get the law implemented on the ground. And we're just as committed to that. So looking forward to having a long-term partnership with you all.
yes, we surely appreciate you very much. You and your team, everybody at the Treatment Advocacy Center, tell them thank you from all of us at Alabama.
I'll do that. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so
All right.
much. Great
Okay, take care,
presentation.
everyone. Have a great
All right.
conference.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.